My name is Violetta Palchik. I'm a graduate student at George Mason University, and this is our panel, Ask a Folklorist, where we're offering career advice. I'd like to let our panelists introduce themselves first. Andy, do you want to start?
Thank you, Violetta. Hi, is this good enough for the for video sound? Okay. So I'm Andy Colobus. I am the Director of Archives and Research at the Vermont Folklife Center in Middlebury, Vermont. My career path is weird in some ways. I guess everybody's is. So I started life finishing undergraduate, having absolutely no clue what I was going to do with myself. Thankfully, I went to a school that was good for me in one way, which they had a winter term where you had to get a job. So it gave me an opportunity, since my parents lived outside the New York City area, to be able to do internships and stuff like that in New York City. And I had a vague interest in libraries and archives, but nothing that was really developed. You know, I didn't quite know how one became a librarian or an archivist at that point. And one of my winter work term jobs involved working as a sort of archival intern at a fantastically weird organization in New York City called the American Society for Psychical Research. So it was a parapsychology organization that had existed since the late 19th century, and it accumulated all this cool stuff over the course of that period. And I was just, doing basic intern stuff, refoldering and things like that. Did a little work in the library at Bennington College, where I went to school, finished school, and had absolutely no idea what I was going to do. I had a vague plan, was trying to stay in Vermont at the time, moved somewhere to get a job, couldn't find a job. In a panic, started calling all of my former employers over that field work term period that it was appropriate to call to see if they had any opportunities. And I happened to call the ASPR, and they're like, "Are you still interested in libraries and archives?" And I was like, "Yes." It's like, "Our librarian just quit. Do you want a job?" And I was like, "Yeah." So in 1993, for $20,000 a year, I took a job in New York City, living with my parents on Long Island and commuting out there for it. So I did that for a bunch, and ended up at grad school at Indiana University for a degree in folklore, once again, not knowing what I was going to do. And somewhere along the line, my girlfriend at the time, her brother-in-law was one of these smart slacker types, and he was going to library school. And I was like, I can do that too. And unfortunately I could, because I was at IU where they had the library school, and I'd finished up all my folklore coursework and thought maybe I can build a career as a folklore archivist. And I'd been doing some of that stuff in various ways at IU. I was, to talk about career building, I had an assistantship working with the MLA International Bibliography as an indexer for the folklore volume. I did some work with some faculty members who were doing archival-oriented stuff. I went to library school and got the credential, and the story of my life is generally odd happenstance and things happening at and the rope drops right before I fall off the wiggly board. So I got an email out of the blue from Jane Beck, the founder of the Folklife Center, saying, and this gets to the networking bit, I talked to Moira Smith, now Moira Marsh, at IU. We're looking for a new archivist, and she suggested I talk to you. So eventually I went through the process, and they hired me, and I've been there since. I'm the kind of person who tends to settle and not want to go anywhere. In the context of libraries and archives, and I can talk a bit more about this later, the barrier to entry is the Master's in Library Science or Library and Information Science. The likelihood of finding a job in that field without that degree is pretty limited, largely because most people have the degree and they want to hire people with the degree. So my advice generally for folks who are interested in doing archival work at a professional level, and I'll give you a more nuanced explanation later too, is that library school is probably essential. And not even just a certificate in archives that accompanies another degree. Like NYU has a master's degree in history with an archival certificate, and even that. Terry can talk about this a bit later too, because Terry's also a librarian and archivist. So anyway, that's kind of me and my career trajectory. I'll pass the mic.
I'm Sue Ilaterio. Can you hear me okay? I always joke that my resume looks like I can't hold a job. But the truth is that I've been interested and fortunate enough to work in a variety of situations and fields. I'm an independent folklorist and an educator and an adjunct faculty member in the Masters in Cultural Sustainability program at Goucher College. I have a MA in American Folk Culture with a minor in Museum Studies from the Cooperstown Graduate Program, and a BA in English with a minor in Education from the University of Delaware. So you can see already that I could never pick one field. I've worked as a classroom teacher, a folklorist in the schools, in museums as an education specialist and a curator, as an arts administrator, as a registrar and collections manager at a science museum, and as a program director for the Illinois Arts Council, and I've also helped start 2 nonprofits. In addition, I've conducted field work and developed public programs, including exhibits, performances, folk arts education workshops and residencies in schools, along with professional development programs for teachers, students, adults, and artists in schools, museums, arts education agencies, and arts organizations across the United States. I'm old. And including co-creating a statewide folk arts curriculum with Lisa Higgins, who's here, with traditional artists and teachers in Missouri. My most recent publication is Statewide Models for Folk Arts and Education in the Missouri Folklorist Society Journal, which Lisa also has a lot to do with, and reviews in the Digestive Journal of Foodways and Culture. I've written 1 book, which is Irish American Material Culture, a Directory of Collection Sites and Festivals in the United States and Canada, which is still in print. It was written in the 80s. I've contributed to a number of encyclopedias, and I've collaboratively written a chapter called Even Presidents Need Comfort Food, Tradition, Food, and Politics at the Valois Cafeteria, and a book on comfort food published by the University of Mississippi Press. It's about President Barack Obama's favorite cafeteria in Chicago, and you should go there if you ever have the chance. This year I've served as a consultant in developing public programming and a traveling exhibit for the Center for Folklore Studies at Ohio State University, and as a consultant for the American Folklife Center in creating programs to repatriate the digitized collection of their Chicago Ethnic Arts Survey to ethnic and cultural organizations and artists in Chicago. And I'll just conclude by saying, like Andy, a lot of my work has been networking, being willing to work as a folklorist, even if that wasn't the title, and being creative. So, thank you.
Hi, my name is Adrian Decker. I'm the Folk and Traditional Arts Manager for the Utah Division of Arts and Museums, which was formerly known as the Utah Arts Council. And to reiterate something that Sue just said about networking and creativity, I think those are going to be really essential sort of things to keep in mind as you start looking into opportunities in the field. Certainly something that has, both things have played a major role in getting me to where I am. To give some background about that sort of journey, I grew up in Southwest Virginia, which is an area very rich in traditional culture, as I'm sure everyone in the room is aware. So that was a really inspiring place to kind of get a sense of not only the importance of seeing traditions celebrated and preserved and showcased publicly, but also kind of gave me a sense, maybe slightly earlier than some other folks, of it being a viable area in which to pursue some kind of employment or just, intellectual pursuit even. So, coming from that environment, in college, I decided to kind of reorient myself from studying English literature into anthropological focus, which I'm very glad I did. I discovered it's actually what I enjoyed a lot more. And after doing that, kind of started exploring opportunities for gaining some professional experience in the field. So I would say my first kind of experience doing folk life specific work was actually with the Blue Ridge Institute in Ferrum, Virginia. Was still a student at the time, but definitely kind of confirmed for me that it was something I very much wanted to continue with in terms of a field. So after that, I took some time off before going to graduate school, kind of worked in health and human services for a bit, but always kind of knew that I wanted to get back into the folk life world, so ended up doing a master's at University of Oregon. And even though my academic interests aren't necessarily kind of in the purview of what the public sector folk life, folklore world typically looks at, I try to be creative about doing classes both in very niche academic interests and in practical skills training for public sector work. And one of the main ways in which I did that was doing a lot of internships and projects with the Oregon Folk Life Network. And because I had built that relationship and done that work, I was also hired by them after I graduated and worked with them for a while. And the position in Utah with the Division of Arts and Museums was reestablished after there had been no folk arts program for a period of about 5 years, and I applied for it and was very fortunate to get the call for an interview. And so I've been in that position for about 3.5 years, a little over that, really focused on reigniting what had been a dormant program. So in addition to the statewide reach of that program, I also co-direct a folk arts museum, which is the Chase Home Museum of Utah Folk Arts. So when we get more into the meat of the conversation, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's kind of where I am.
Good morning, my name is Lisa Higgins, and I'm the director of the Missouri Folk Arts Program. The Missouri Folk Arts Program is like your position, as a statewide position that serves, serves the state, traditional artists, small arts organizations, large arts organizations, community scholars. We collaborate with folklorists at other universities and other culture workers around the state. The Missouri Folk Arts Program is based at a museum, an academic museum, university museum, Museum of Art and Archaeology at the University of Missouri in Columbia. I have no training in museum studies, but in 1993, the Missouri Folk Arts Program was under the auspices of a Center for Missouri Studies, something like that. It was a really cool center, and was based in a historic home that happens to be on campus. And they did cultural geography and rural sociology and urban sociology. I mean, just a most incredible combination of professors. They actually did an archaeological dig on the grounds before they opened the center, and did some restoration on the house. So there's a lot of collaboration going on there and a lot of work with students. That all happened before I came along. And but about the time I came along, anyone who's involved in university culture, or really any sort of culture that's funded with public dollars, there are peaks and valleys, and funding was in a valley, and the center was eliminated. But there were people on campus at the museum, actually, and the Missouri Arts Council, which funds the Missouri Folk Arts Program, provides quite a bit of our operating support. They wanted to keep the Folk Arts Program, and I believe that's because of the National Endowment for the Arts focus. It has a dedicated funding for folk and traditional arts, and they were encouraged, and so a partnership came together, and we've been a two-person office since 1993. Again, all of that was sort of before my time. I was a graduate student in folk studies in the English department at the University of Missouri. At that time, I thought I was going to be a professor. I am a first-generation college student. That was, my parents really, they didn't have college educations. They understood how important it was. It was a huge dream. They both of them almost didn't graduate from high school. So it was a huge theme in my life growing up that they wanted us all to go to college. So when I graduated from high school, I got a job at Pizza Hut and moved into a trailer park and drove a crappy little car because I didn't want to go to college. Then that expectation, I took some gap years, and after working really hard and not making anything, by that time my mom had gotten a job at Arkansas State University, and I was able to move back home and live with them and go to college for virtually free. I think I was paying $5 per credit hour, and my books cost more. So that's all to my mother's credit that I had some kind of a college education. From there, I was able to then pursue a master's degree. By that point, I had met some folklorists in the department. William Clements, who some of you may have read in your studies, does stuff with folk religion and Native American studies. Also, Marcia Godet was at Arkansas State. She had spent a few years in Jonesboro teaching before going back to Lafayette. And so I was introduced to her. I did a master's degree also at Arkansas State. I was offered tuition waiver and a graduate assistantship. I really focused a lot on teaching, of course, in an English department, teaching composition. So I started teaching, as a grad student and tutoring back in 1986, Once I started, by the way, after, having my gap years, my sort of working class gap years, I did my undergraduate degree in like 3 years, and I did my master's in about a year and a half, and then applied to grad schools, and chose Missouri because of the right amount of distance it was. Well, they accepted me, which was huge, and offered me a teaching assistantship and a tuition waiver. But I knew there were folklorists in the department at the University of Missouri, and I had a strong interest in that already. Didn't exactly know what I wanted to do with it. And they also had rhetoric and composition professors, and I already had an interest in some schooling in that as well. So that turned out to be pretty well, but around 1993, when the Missouri Folk Arts Program was being downsized, from this incredible center to a two-person office, I met the then director and the folk arts specialist at a party at Elaine Lawless, my professor and advisor's house. And I had no idea there was any such thing as public sector folklore before then, and it was sort of an epiphany and life-changing for me. The next week, another graduate student and I went and asked if it was possible for them to figure out a way for us to do internships. And from that internship, which was about a year that I did, I was able to do short little gigs for folk arts. I did some paid work as a graduate assistant. I did some site visits, outside evaluations, a little bit of field work and that sort of thing, which led me to getting a gig at South Arts, which is a regional, with Peggy Bulger, who some of you may have heard of also. It ultimately ended up at the American Folklife Center, and did a really sort of an apprenticeship with her in 2 years, an intensive, to the extent that when Dana Everett-Spain decided to leave the Missouri Folk Arts Program as director, she faxed me the job notice, and I applied. And so I went from being an intern in the early 90s to being the director in the late 90s. I'll stop there because we have a lot of questions, and I'm sure I've gone over 3 minutes.
Thank you. So basically with this forum, we wanted to create an opportunity for everyone to be able to engage and ask questions and get advice from seasoned folklorists. So we've broken the forum down into 3 sections. Each one focuses on a topic. The first being preparing for the workforce. The second is finding work, and the third is success at work. So at the beginning of each section, we'll ask 2 questions that we received before coming to AFS. And then after the 2 questions are answered, we'll open up the floor for discussion, and anyone here can ask more questions. At the very end, then it'll just be kind of free-form Q&A time. So we'll start with Lisa.
So the question that I was given is, what skills do you think are most necessary for students and beginning professionals to develop as they begin to enter either the academic or public workforce, and how can or should they develop these skills? So I work in a university setting, but I'm not teaching, and I haven't taught since 1997, but I taught for 10 years. I am interacting, so all that to be said is I'm not an expert on academic jobs, but I am surrounded by academics. So I think this should apply as well. I think the most important thing that you can do, and I think you heard that in every introduction up here, is to do volunteer work and internships and any kind of opportunity that comes your way that works for you, to actually apply what you're learning in your program into the field, to practical applications. You know, I did field work for seminar papers. That's nothing compared to actually going out and sitting down with people you might not know, and having the equipment and learning the equipment and being able to do an interview or do interviews. And in fact, I will tell you that field work is not my forte. My forte really is administration. And I feel like that comes, I do a lot of grant writing and grant reporting. Those are things that I learned with Peggy Bulger at South Arts. There are also things that I learned, I think, from teaching composition, because I learned about audience and language and applying different words to different scenarios. I'd say the majority of what I do in my job is writing, whether it's grant proposals or helping other people write grant proposals, final reports, interim reports, magazine articles, short articles for our museum, reports to the director, reports to the Missouri Arts Council about what it is we've been doing with their money, you know, those sorts of things. It's a lot of also applying my skills in rhetoric and composition. So as someone who had an internship at the Missouri Folk Arts Program, when I came back as director, that had kind of waned in the 2 years that I was gone. And it was very important to me to create that opportunity for other people. So over the course of about 13 to 15 years, I think we had about, and I don't have the exact numbers, we had about 13 to 15 interns who were studying folklore in the English department at the University of Missouri. Not all of those folks have gone on to be public folklorists. One is a tenured professor at a community college in the south side of Chicago. One is the director of local learning, which is our national organization for folk arts and education. And before that, she worked in other positions. And another teaches at a small private four-year college in Missouri. Those are 3 examples. So not everyone who did the internship with us actually ended up in a public program, but they all felt like the skills that they learned were still important ones that they used, even in the academic jobs. I remember specifically talking to one of them. She was really eager, and I had showed her a job announcement. It may have been at the American Folklife Center or the Smithsonian or something like that. And she said, well, I don't have any of those skills. And I said, yeah, that's what you, so to me, that's like the template. If you see a job that thrills you, even though you're not ready for it, you're still in school or that's a few years ahead of you, look at what the job requirements are, and those are the skills that you really can develop. That job may open up at some point in your career, but another job like it's probably going to open up. But figure out what it is that's your passion. And that's worked very well. I mean, that person in particular wanted to do some work in public sector, and I encouraged her, you know, one of the job requirements for the dream job was to be fluent in Spanish, to have some fluency in Spanish. And so she really focused on that as the one language to become proficient in while she was in grad school. You know, I did 2 languages, you know, that typical, you know, minimum proficiency in 2 languages, do translation. So didn't do that. Nobody gave me this kind of advice because people were training me as an academic to be an academic until I discovered the Missouri Folk Arts Program. I would also say an important thing to do is to use your folklore skills. If you're a folklorist at this point, if you're studying, and interview people that have jobs that you want. Don't be intimidated by those folks. They love, obviously, to talk about themselves. Can tell you how they got to where they are today, what the path was. It's not always as direct as you think, and I think you hear that from all of us as well. And I'll stop right there for now. Okay.
So, Adrian?
Following up on the comment that Lisa made about audience, I think thinking about that very critically as you begin your job hunt is going to serve you very well. because looking at job requirements and kind of tailoring your skill set to fit those things is incredible advice, and I also would reiterate that. But sometimes you also have to read between the lines in terms of what the recruiter is actually asking for or needs to benefit their organization. Sometimes what I've noticed is, especially some of the larger institutions, they kind of they're locked into a model of hiring or recruitment that it follows some kind of state standard or company standard or nonprofit standard that's been very long established, but so they tend to do things a little bit by rote in terms of classifications for positions and things like that. And so perhaps, you know, someone leaves their job as a folk arts coordinator and they think, okay, well, we've got to refill this, so they kind of copy paste a job description, but that might not actually be what the agency wants or needs in terms of the direction that they're moving in. And so it really behooves you to kind of look at, you know, what are their strategic priorities? What audiences are they trying to serve? What are some of the initiatives they have going on at a larger level? And then you, as the folklorist or the folklore-friendly person, can come in and say, you know, with my perspective and my training, this is how I can help you achieve that goal. And you might find that, you know, if you get that job, they're perfectly happy to continue to call you a folklorist, but you also might find that title shift a bit. Another thing I want to say, kind of going to the question, which I know I need to read, I realized I was like, wait a minute, jumped into that a little fast there. So yes, let me circle back to the question. What does the current folklore job market look like? How would you suggest new professionals market themselves and direct their energies? In terms of what it looks like, I have been pleasantly surprised by how many folklore, folk arts, folk life titled jobs are opening up, and I think that's, you know, largely kind of a generational changing of the guard, you know, because people are retiring or just moving into different sectors as they, you know, they have more stability in their own lives to be able to do that, and I think that's a great thing. I'm a bit, you can call me cynical, that will last for a super long time, because going back to what I mentioned about the way that the agencies that hire folklorists are changing their missions, their priorities, their goals. And I don't think you can count, at least in the purview of like a state folklorist position. 10, 20 years, I don't know if that's really going to exist anymore. It'd be great, it would be wonderful, but as the model has functioned for a long time, I don't know if it's realistic to expect that will continue. So that being said, I think building your networks in other sectors that are kind of parallel or have a lot of shared philosophies or sort of skill sets with folklorists is really important. So your museum professionals, your arts administrators, but most importantly, I would say the culture workers in the communities that we serve, right? I think really building strong relationships with those individuals and those organizations that are very community-based, grassroots, that really have a better sense of how the large political and economic forces that at work in our country are really, you know, impacting people's lives, and really getting a thorough understanding of that through working with them, then being able to be that sort of mediator between the institution and the community, which is what folklorists have done for, you know, decades upon decades. So I think as you are engaged in your job hunt, finding a way to have some of those conversations is going to be really key. I think also understanding that, especially working with some, you know, those community-based organizations that I mentioned and those networks, the term folk can be very alienating. I know we've talked about this as a field for quite a long time, but it is very, you know, you will get the comment, and you should expect to, like, why are we considered folk? Or why aren't we just doing art? Or, you know, that will come up, and you need to not feel like you're being antagonized. You just need to realize that, yeah, we're coming from this disciplinary political perspective that is, historical, and we might think we have good reasons, but there's another perfectly valid argument for why there's some problems with that. So basically the point I'm trying to get to is delay your sense of attachment to this folk categorization, and I think it will open up a lot more possibilities for you, and also will kind of help you to realize some of the things you are interested in that you didn't know you were interested in, right? As a public folklorist type, right? So I'm gonna stop there and kick it to the next question.
Thank you, Lisa and Adrian. So now we're actually going to open up the floor if anyone has any questions that relate to preparing for the workforce.
May I ask
Yeah,
a-
yeah. Andy.
I'd like to ask a question of the panel. Some of the interesting discussions I've heard come up this year at AFS around infrastructure in relation to public work. One of the comments someone made, and because I'm so burnt, I don't remember who it was, but it was smart and it wasn't me, was that maybe we're at the horizon of this sort of Bess Lomax Hawes kind of vision for public folklore. So this is stated in. I'm going to keep talking because this is stated in light of that comment. So I wonder, what I've seen in New England is within the Arts Council's hiring folk arts coordinators is a fusing of the positions generally with community arts, and from my impression is from the perspective of the administrators a conflation of the two, and the result is that they're hiring more people with arts administration credentials as opposed to folklorists. And the question to all of you is there a value from your perspective in someone who wants to do public folklore work in an arts administrative context to get arts administration credential?
19 years ago, I was hired for this job, 19 years ago in September, to be the director of the Missouri Folk Arts Program. I was interviewed by the director of the museum at the university, so our home department basically, and I was interviewed by the director of the Missouri Arts Council and one of the council members. There were also about 12 people on a hiring committee that I also had to sit in front of during the job interview, and all of them were folklorists and cultural workers. So there were a whole lot of perspectives in play there. Ray Brasseur asked me, what are you going to do with all of that archival material that's sitting in the office? Okay, that's not my forte. And I said, I don't know, but I will research it because I've been taught to research. But the director of the State Arts Council, and really they provide, again, the majority of the operating support through a grant, asked me, do you consider yourself a folklorist or do you consider yourself a folk arts administrator? And I said, I'll always be a folklorist. I've been trained to be a folklorist. I said, but I consider myself to be a folk arts administrator. This is a public position. We're doing work for the Arts Council. We're going to be working with, grant writing and programs and public programs to help other people. And I could see her sort of mentally say, because I knew that's what they wanted and that's what I wanted. And I think that, but I think it goes back, our training as folklorists, we meet so many different people, and to me, I just apply those schools or those studies to everybody I meet. I've educated a lot of executive directors at the Missouri Arts Council. We've been through a few in 19 years. About what it is that we do. They may not understand and be able to quote you a definition of folklore or folk arts, but as one woman said to me at some point, she said, I don't really understand what it is that you do, but just keep doing it. So what they like is the engagement and the results. And adjacent careers came up. Like I said, I'm working at a museum, you're working at a museum. I wasn't trained in museum studies. I'm learning that on the side. I'm helping with the convening in the spring in arts and aging with the executive assistant. The executive assistant was hired to be the assistant to the ED of the Arts Council, and she asked to do other more interesting work. So she's also the accessibility coordinator, and she's doing work on creative aging. It's like, to me, it's also kind of, where do you find the spaces to make the work that you love, and to get other people involved?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think we should, no, I was gonna ask from you guys.
I just wanted to go off that, you said that, you're not trained in museum studies or anything like that, and I've been adjacent to museum studies most of my academic career, and I've always gotten the impression, and right or wrong, I've always gotten the impression that if you don't start with an internship freshman year, you're never gonna get a job, so don't worry about it. Do something else. And I'm not gonna lie, that's definitely dissuaded me personally from doing certain things.
Yeah.
Because, I'm in my late 20s at that time, and I don't wanna do an internship for no money, 10 hours a week, So some of those more logistical, tangential things, kind of wrapped together with the more kind of cynical, you have to get in early. And I just wonder what you all think about that, especially since it seems like you've all kind of had a completely different experience.
Let me jump in with two comments on that. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later too. But yeah, one of the realities, in addition to the potential horizon of the idea that there are federally funded, almost guaranteed state positions, which is changing, is that when some of us did our internships, and I fell into both museum work and folklore through internships, paid, full-time paid with benefit internships. National Museum Act, National Endowment for the Humanities. My first 3 years of funding were internships, my first 3 paid jobs. So that has changed, you're right. One thing I think we should advocate as a field for actually is going back to paid internships, because as Lisa and I think Adrian said, one of the opportunities when you do an internship is to try a bunch of different things, because a lot of times I didn't have any idea what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to be an English teacher. I was offered one interview when I graduated from college, and they told me they didn't want any fancy college ideas. And I thought, well, that's kind of why I went to college. And there was an internship at a museum working with inner city kids, and it was paid. And I had done a lot of work as a camp counselor, and I'd also worked to learn a lot about teaching in the inner city, and I got it, and that's what led me eventually to. So, but I also want to say, as someone who's changed careers multiple times, don't fall into that trap of thinking you have to start early. But what I will say, and this is going to sound privileged, but if you think you want to do museum work, then volunteer. Museums need board members, and most boards now are trying to diversify by age as well as everything else. So one thought is volunteer to be on a board. You'll get to know some powerful people typically. You'll get to know some, because usually boards, they recruit for financial background as well. And it'll give you some insights into what's going on in the organization that might be just as useful to you.
Yeah.
I'm surely not as administratively gifted as Lisa, but
Few of us are.
things like grant writing and going through IRB processes are something that we all need to at least get to a baseline competency level on. Is there a way to have a paradigm shift where we don't see this merely as an annoying hurdle that we have to jump over, but it actually is part of the learning process? And how can we have that paradigm shift? Because I want to, maybe enjoy is too strong of a word, but I want to kind of benefit from all this grant writing and admin, let's say, that I'm doing.
Well, yeah, I mean, with IRB work, I get it. I had to do it for my dissertation. I really don't have to do it for the work that we're doing now, but I have lots of friends who do, and the graduate students that worked in the graduate student workers who we employed. And so, but for years I understand, why do journalists and oral historians get to, waive the IRB, but we don't? But you know, the other thing, think about as folklorists how incredibly important it is for us that I think we have a sort of tenet in our field to do ethical work. And that's really what they're asking us to do, is do ethical work. And we should be proving that, and probably could be running some IRBs eventually if we could kind of jump over that hurdle in thought. But I know it's, you know, I think, again, you know, using those folklore skills to create relationships with the people in the IRB office. You know, I've had to write to them for just, you know, ask people and interact with people in whatever way it might be. We end up partnering, even as a public program, with a number of professors and other folks on campus, and it's no reason why it couldn't be that. I think it's just an application of our folklore skills.
Can I say one thing about grant writing too? That again, the best way to really understand how to write grants and the value of them and the importance of it is to be on a panel. And every single organization that gives out grants, except, well, private foundations get to do their own thing for the most part, but they're always looking for panelists, and they're looking for content specialists. And once you sit on a panel, you will never write a grant in the same way again, because you'll then, you know, it's kind of like being a book reviewer, or, you know, once you review somebody else's book, then you start to think about, what did I really want to read, you know? So that's my other advice is, and again, they need diversity, and they need different backgrounds, and they tend to kind of go to the same people they know because it's easy and they're time stricken, but think about that.
Great advice.
All right, so moving on to our next section, finding work. We're going to start with Adrian. Please read the question first.
I'll do better this time. Okay, so our question is, what are some good resources for finding public folklore or folklore adjacent jobs? Is it essential to look outside the folklore sphere? Well, I think based on what I said previously, y'all probably know that my perspective is, yeah, you definitely should be looking outside the folklore sphere. But in terms of resources for job hunting, I know we all have too many emails coming to us, but subscribe to as many newsletters as you can, or you can stand, especially from these kind of large state or national sort of consortiums or organizations that are about advocacy for a particular field, or are about you know, just sharing information about what's going on with a particular sort of interest, right? So historic preservation newsletters, museums newsletters, you know, sort of diversity and inclusion and equity work newsletters. Like, these are all going to bring kind of opportunities to your digital doorstep, so to speak, that you may not have even known to look for. So I've found that to be a really useful way of just seeing what's out there. I think also at convenings like this, talking with colleagues from widely sort of different positions within the field is also really valuable, especially if, again, you're trying to gauge kind of where your interests lie or might lie in the future. I will say that in terms of sort of thinking about the folklorist perspective as a lens through which we view the world, which I think many of us would feel comfortable with that description, but also a lens that you can look at a particular project or work, or, you know, sort of workflow through. I think that we have a lot of opportunities cropping up in the museums field to kind of follow up on that discussion, because there is beginning to be a much more sort of robust conversation in that field about inclusion and community curation and community authorship. And that's the kind of discussion that we as a field have been having for a long time. And we've had some successes in making some of those things come to fruition, providing platforms, amplifying voices. And the museums field as a whole is very much sort of looking in that direction as, again, the new paradigm or a paradigm that they're very much interested in seeing more successes in. So I think that if you have an interest, again, not even necessarily at the level of exhibit curation and development, but audience development or evaluation, or a lot of museums now are really looking at producing programming outside their four walls, which I think is incredibly exciting, and doing more, sort of events in the community, doing festivals, doing markets, things of that nature. So I think that offers a lot of intriguing possibilities for folklorists. I think that sort of thinking about the process of landing work, sometimes with positions that are posted, there's not full commitment necessarily from the agency. Maybe it's a part-time position or it's a contract position, and sometimes needs must, you kind of go where the work is. But I think with experience and with strategy, you have the opportunity to make the case. This is what I can do to you, do for you. Yeah, we're gonna gang up on them. Do for you with my skill set and with the relationships that I've built if I have full support. Look at what we've accomplished so far. If you want to see this increase and expand and be, something that's sustainable, this is what I need. And you get into sort of that bargaining area. But again, because we're so people oriented and we're so much about relationships and so much about dialogue, I do think we have an advantage in those discussions as a field. So those are some things to consider.
Andy?
Old guy throat. What strategies do you suggest for networking? What's worked best for you at AFS and outside of AFS? I'll start with the second half of the question, mostly because I'm really bad at consciously thinking about networking. But I recognize, although I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps and have done everything by my own power, I've my career is basically built on people doing stuff for me. I mean, and a lot of those relationships, the foundational ones, started in graduate school, and since most people in this field are going to go to graduate school as a part of the credentialing to do the work. The relationships you build with your professors and with your fellow students can be very significant for down the road, and in my case, if Jane had called Moira and Moira hadn't mentioned my name, I would not be where I am now, and that was a big deal, and that was the result. I mean, I don't know, I would say maybe Moira was just wanted to help Jane, but I worked for Moira, I showed up for my job, I didn't, complain about stuff out of line. I did what I was supposed to do. I tried to be friendly, courteous, helpful, and all that stuff. And I suppose that was a factor, in why she's like, oh, Andy's doing this, and Andy's not a jerk as far as I can tell. So I managed to deceive her. Deception is the other part of networking. And then I had a boss, Jane Beck, who is a foundational figure in public folklore, who advocated for me all the time. I mean, I met Sue because of PACT, because Jane dragged me into this effort of hers to document archives around the state. Jane was an advocate for me. Now, I think maybe that had more to do with Jane than with me. I think there's a tendency to be like, I don't want to admit that I've made a mistake, so I'm going to keep promoting this guy's abilities, and hopefully he'll deliver. But those kinds of things have made a big difference for me professionally. And a lot of them are rooted in happenstance. Sometimes I feel like I happen to fall in with decent people, who weren't self-serving and who had other interests. And then I also feel like I did what was expected of me in the context of those relationships, so people knew I was dependable. In other areas of my career, and a lot of this is not really good advice because I think a lot of the platforms are outmoded. But, I was a prominent figure on certain listservs, and people got to know me because I was posting to these listservs, and they, for whatever reason, appreciated what I had to say on them, and they're like, oh, this guy must know something. Deception. And that kind of stuff, it's weird in the way it snowballs, I'll say the other thing that's been real beneficial for me has been spending time with colleagues that I like, that's so that once you have a foot in the door, in employment, engaging with those people around you who you share values with, whose work you respect and admire, and just hanging out with them, you begin to build relationships that begin to snowball into cementing other kinds of things down the road, and that's been really true for me. I was never really like the sort of, hi, how you doing? I'm Andy, here's my card, kind of, like that was always antithetical to how I thought about talking to people, but, and I guess I can step back a bit too and talk, because we've been doing a lot of hiring at the Folklife Center over the last, I don't know, couple, it feels like forever, but knowing who someone is makes a difference when you're reflecting on an application when you have 50 of them. But also being able to deliver, on the impression that you've made makes a big difference too. So if we were to, and this is not the case, and I'll be frank, but like if we were to get applications from people who were like, we know that guy and we know he really likes to put himself out there, but we've never seen him actually do anything, all the networking you've done is not going to make a difference. But building a reputation through letting people know what you're capable of and demonstrating it is enormous for us as someone who's hiring, enormous, because it's like, well, we got, especially when you've got 50 applications to sort through, which we kind of have in the past. There was some other point I was going to make, and I've already forgotten it.
Thank you.
Yes.
No, thank you so much. I just want to jump in about Andy because I think one of the other things he's done, and I want to encourage you, and I know I'm encouraging you to do a lot of work and volunteer in some cases, but I do think it pays off. And that is, think about what skill sets you have and think about creative ways to showcase those. So Andy did a workshop a few years back on digital photography.
Audio recording.
Audio recording, I'm
I
sorry.
can't take pictures.
Sorry, audio recording. And, I'm so old that, I remember when we had 2 people had to carry the video camera to do documentation. And I was very resistant to go to digital. I just, I was just scared of it. And going to a workshop with Andy and being made to feel like this is something you can do, and it's a skill set you need, it cemented my impression of Andy, not just as, he's making a lot of jokes about deception, but the truth is he's incredibly talented and incredibly generous with helping people learn different aspects of the field. And that's something to think about as well. So if you meet somebody and there's an opportunity, especially in your region or your locale, to do a workshop or to do a presentation or to offer a program, think about that. Terry's been doing that with archiving here. I couldn't get to the pre-session last year, and I'm trying to start dealing with my personal archives. So I reached out to Terry and said, if I send you the fee, can you give me the material that I'm going to miss from the workshop? And she said yes. And again, that kind of a generosity. So I'm not saying give your work away, but do think about ways that you can showcase it, because that's the other aspect of networking. And I think Andy has said that already.
Well, no, that's a good point. Do I have a couple seconds, or am I?
Yeah,
Should I stop? And this wasn't sort of calculated, right? It was really rooted in my interests, and to go to the issue of skill building, right? I showed up at the Vermont Folklife Center, and suddenly they presented me with a giant stack of tape recorders, and I was responsible for knowing how to use them, and I had done really very little audio recording prior to taking the job, so I had a crash course. And from that crash course and from that work expectation, and in the benefit of the organization and my interests, I was able to find a niche and say, in the early aughts, we were in the midst of a big transition from analog recording to non-media based file digital recording, and there were a lot of people who were at sea about it. So like I was able to say, I can teach a workshop that will help you go from cassette to, I mean, at this point, something along these lines, you know, and I met a ton of people doing that, you know, and like it wasn't like a cynical effort on my part. It wasn't like, this is calculated, I'll draw these people into my, you know, it was just like, I actually like this, I'm excited about it, I have the skills, let's see what, wow, people like it, you know. And so looking for sort of those opportunities to find a sort of vacancy with a need, and if you have the capacity to fill that need, it can be enormous, you know, it can be enormous, so yeah. So let's looking at here. I mean, you know, like fundamentally to me, it's networking personally, right? And I want to hear other people's perspectives on this too, if there's time, because I've never been one of those like active self-promotion. In part because I've been lucky and have had jobs. I mean, I think that's, you know, I've never needed to necessarily hustle in that way. And I'll go back to something Lisa said, you know, that to me, the best kind of folklore training, and you know, I learned a lot of this from Greg Sharrow, quite honestly. I learned a lot of this on the job, is learning how to listen. You know, and like the interviews to me are less about asking questions than about taking what comes in. You know, so when engaging with people, use those skills that you use to interview. You know, the issue of sort of empathy, compassionate listening, engaged listening, and you know, people like to be listened to. You know, and it's respectful, but it also helps build the foundation of a relationship. So that's like a sort of just to say how we take our skills and training and apply them to the career path. So. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience on finding work?
I sort of do.
Yeah.
But it's not really, like, I don't want to waste anybody's time. It's not really related to finding the work necessarily, because, like, I feel like I'm not at a place to complain, like, oh, nobody listened to me, or like, I couldn't find any jobs, or I didn't get any internships, so I'm not there. And I can't complain. I met wonderful people. I was listened to a lot, and I was really lucky. I'm on the lucky side of things. In my case, my issue is a little bit different. I love working project-based, and I was lucky enough to find funding for my projects too. And I did have network too. I knew people who worked in the areas that I like to do my projects. So I studied in Turkey, and I also studied in the United States, and I knew people who had answers to my questions. And I wanted to have my team mostly in Turkey, Turkey-based, but I had difficulty motivating them because of the political circumstances. So initially everybody was like, oh yeah, let's do it, and then you go in and then you find lots of depressed people who lost their hopes or who are so scared. And they consider you as the saved person, like you're safe, you will go back, you have something to go back to. And we don't know what to do, and everybody is, you know, like they sink in those dark thoughts, and you have a camera person who is depressed, and then your mentor has a trial, so she can't come. So this is the sort of situation you end up with. And then you also don't want to really partner with any state institution or ministry, because in some villages that I visited, I ended up hearing lots of hateful stories. And sometimes, I mean, sometimes people hate the state, sometimes people hate the neighbor village, because there is a lot of polarization. And I mean, I don't want to go into the political details of it, but you end up with those stories, and I don't think that's the right time to share those stories at this point anyway. So in this kind of situation, what do you do? What do you tell people to stand up and continue continue. Because I can't promise anything. I'm not, I mean, I wish I could, but I'm just looking for partners to work with. And that's all I can do. I was wondering if you have any suggestions for that.
So I'm going to repeat what you said a little bit, so that there's two things you're talking about. One is when people that you're collaborating with aren't motivated to finish or to complete work, which happens to everyone. And the perhaps more complex issue is when there's political issues that are fraught, that even danger for people to do the work, or they perceive that if they do this kind of work that they're advocating for one position over another, kind of. So the one thing I'll say is, well, I'm going to tell you a quick funny story. I think I have time. Do I have time? It's not as serious, but it does get to this idea of there being, because I do think that that's one complication of our work, especially when we're working in public sector, is we use terms like community, and we even against our better knowledge and nature, we make assumptions that everybody from a community is all on the same page, and that everyone agrees, and everyone loves each other, and everyone has the same values and that's often not the case. So years ago, I did research for a museum in upstate New York on the Greek American community, and everything went well. I did a bunch of field work. We had this beautiful exhibit. We did our opening ceremony at one of the Orthodox churches, and what I didn't know is that there were people from two different villages from Greece in this small upstate New York community who pretty much hated each other. And I'm going to tell you a funny part, even though we're on video, I might as well go, what the hell. Because we asked about personal stuff. So the night before, a friend of mine had decided that we were going to break tradition, and we were going to drink brandy and smoke cigars, because we were women and we could do this. And so along with our husbands, we drank a lot of brandy, and I had never smoked tobacco in my life, and I smoked part of a cigar, which is pretty amazing, and ended up with my head in my child's little porta potty because I couldn't get off the floor because I was so ill. And I had to open this exhibit the next day, so I took a bunch of Dramamine, and I blurrily went to this exhibit opening where I thought everybody was going to be happy, because we were celebrating the Greek American community. And the two factions broke out into a fight, a huge fight, screaming at each other. Well, I was hungover and very ill from smoking a cigar, so I burst into tears. And the great thing is that in Greek American culture, and probably in Greece, you do not make women cry. So the women started yelling at the men, "You're making her cry. Stop it." And everyone stopped. Everyone was shocked and realized that they had, made a woman cry. And then we went on, and everything was fine for the rest of the opening. But it's just an example of that not on the same serious level that you're addressing, but that I think that's a really important point, that when we work with community, there are a lot of things going on. There's class, there's race, there's gender, there's all kinds of issues. The best answer I can give you, other than bursting into tears, which is probably not very effective, but sometimes may work, is to try to kind of keep going back to the mission of the work, and trying to get people to, whatever buy-in they had when they first started working with you, trying to go back to how did we buy into this together in the first place, and how can we continue? And in terms of motivating distance workers, I think that's it is tricky. I mean, especially, again, I will say something that, I'll just say something that I think Andy pointed out, and I think it's true. When we talk about networking, there's networking and there's networking, and there's working with people, and one of the things I think is very complicated about this work now is that we can do stuff remotely. And I teach online, and I can tell you, but I teach also it's a low residency program, so twice a year, our students come together as a cohort, and we actually get to meet them face to face. The difference between working with students that I've met face to face and students I've never met face to face is night and day. Because I think there's a relationship that happens when we meet face to face that's very difficult to duplicate remotely, so.
Can I just reframe the question a little bit? So I do go in person.
Mm.
So when I start something in Turkey, I am in Turkey, so I go. And I also do find a way out. Like I find a way to do what I want to do, because I mean I travel all the way and I'm in Turkey and I have limited amount of time. So when somebody is too depressed to work, I mean I find another way to manage that. And sometimes it's just my grandpa calling people and just saying. And I'm the first. I'm like you actually. I'm the first university graduate in my family. And he's just like, we need a person here. Somebody shows up, and I'm like, okay, you have to use the camera because I can't use the camera and the voice recorder, and I also talk to people all at the same time, so I need those people. And I end up finding the people actually from the community. So they come, they help, and they get excited, but the issue mostly happens with the people with the expertise. So in the academia, basically there is this huge level of depression that I feel, and it is like that loss of hope. It is always at the back of my mind as I keep working on things. So that was.
We have some time. First of all, I don't think anybody or most of us that I know up here can even begin to imagine the complexity of what you're dealing with. So I don't want any of our anecdotes to lessen the severity. No, it's really important. I mean, I think there's a level of, I have friends and colleagues who are friends right now who believe they're living in the kind of climate that you're talking about, and they are immobilized by it. And I think that's a level of privilege and entitlement that is troubling to me, and that can distract them from work. And I think, not that we don't have real issues, and that isn't important to, foresee what might happen again. But it's hard, and even things as not mundane, but every day, as also, I have a lot of friends of my age that we are dealing, the thing that's depressing and immobilizing for us perhaps could be dealing with aging parents, a distraction, from the job. We're a two-person office, and both of us have, mothers who require a lot of attention and help, and, one might fall, and, how do you fulfill your daily, job, or prepare for a meeting, a panel review, for instance. We have a panel review this week, and one of our panelists had an unexpected death in her family, and the panel's on Thursday. How do you deal with that? And I think that's one of the things I will say is I think that one of our greatest assets, I think one of the greatest assets for people, for instance, who work in public programs, because we make a lot out of a little, is to be nimble. And what you just talked about with, for instance, your turn to your grandfather, and for him to like recruit somebody for you, that you can turn on a dime and figure out how to make things work. And if you can do that and have some results and some successes, maybe not what you anticipated doing or you foresaw would happen, then you can work with what you have. And that's really the best that any of us can do, whether it's this oppressive regime or,
Yeah, I mean, as I said, like,
Yeah.
I'm not educated,
Yeah.
explain. I ended up, the project evolved a lot.
Yeah.
I started with the idea of making an animated documentary of me and a few other people collecting stories and animating some of those stories. And then I ended up with a map, like 2 layers of maps that you navigate, and in one surface you see the stories, and on the other one you see the news that are on the newspapers. So I ended up with something like that because circumstances required that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I
Yeah.
appreciate the answer. Thank you.
Okay, so we're coming up to our third category, success at work. And we'll start with Andy.
Hi, I'm Andy. So this particular question I shall read aloud. A lot of jobs are in folklore-adjacent areas. What strategies, from your personal experience, do you suggest for navigating work in an organization such as this? So, my experience is very fortunate that I've been in a folklore organization, functioning in a folklore-adjacent role, if that makes sense. The way I would have to answer this goes back to something I said earlier, and I'll speak pretty much just in regard to archival work, where I'll just reiterate that the likelihood of getting a job as an archivist without library school training is really low. And that if you want to do that, you kind of have to do the library school training. If you want to do the library school training, in my opinion, there are different tracks within that area that will make a difference in helping you find work in a folklore adjacent area. And those things really rely on developing skills in digital archives and digital libraries. The romance of working with old papers and old books and old images is powerful. That's one of the things that got me engaged with this. The reality is there's way less work in those areas, those positions that, as I've seen, aren't being replaced with people who do just that. So the expectation from what I've seen, and I think Terry later can chime in about this if people are interested, is that in the context of archives, digital applications are really the kinds of things people are looking for. Super niche interests, like being a folklore archivist, are real limited opportunities, like recently we were hiring for a 1-year terminal fellowship position in archives, and we received numerous applications. And I guess one thing I'll address, if that's okay, and if it's not, please tell me, is the issue of job applications and my experience with vetting applicants. And one thing that maybe I'm not clear if, I didn't really get this until I started doing it, is the people who ultimately end up as finalists on the job have a lot to do with the pool of applicants that came in. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, it's often throw your hat in the ring. If the job application process is not too onerous, you never know who's going to apply or who's not, right? So if we were hiring, in the end, right, we said we need someone with a credential. But if we didn't get anybody with that credential, and your application was in there and you had experience, you probably would have been considered for the job. That stated, if you have no experience, you're only aggravating the people reading the application, because that's one more person they're going to have to write to say, I'm sorry, thank you for your application, but So anyway, but for elements, in my experience, for the kinds of folklore adjacent jobs where there is a developed credentialing system for that employment, it's probably necessary that you participate in that credentialing system. A question I asked the museum people here is, my wife is an anthropologist who teaches museum studies class through the museum on campus at UVM, and what she's seeing increasingly is a professionalization and credentialing process occurring with museum professionals around museum studies degrees, which I perceive as kind of a complementary thing to the notion of where the MLS emerged from. And so my impression is that increasingly museums are going to be looking for people with museum studies credentials. So once again, you know, it is often the question is, it's often a hardship, and in the case of museum jobs and library and archive jobs, unless you're a high-level administrator, and most of us aren't, they're not paid very well, you know. So it becomes that question of, you know, sort of privilege. Can I afford to do this? Is it worth it in the end? But so, you know, that would be how I would answer this question, and I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer or not, but I'll pass it along from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. All right, Susan?
So, and I'm really anxious to hear, and so my answer is relatively short.
And please read the question first.
Oh, yeah, and I'm really anxious to hear from all of you about what else you'd like to know about or talk about. So my question is, how difficult is it to transition from the public sector to academia and vice versa, both on a career development level as well as on a personal one? As public folklorists, do you consider yourselves academics still? So I have to start with a full disclosure that I only transitioned to academia in 2013, and I received my MA degree in 1983. So I did teach at the college level in the late 90s as an adjunct, but I'm still working on being able to say I'm an academic with a straight face at the same time. I deliberately went for an MA, not a PhD, back in the 70s, 80s, because I wanted to work with the public. I wanted to work in the public sphere. So at the same time, I think there are skill sets that are the same in the public sector work and in the academy. A goal of using research, writing, and other forms of communication to add to knowledge and understanding in a specific field or fields. Being able to teach adults not only the facts of a field, but the skill sets to explore, learn, and add to them. And helping people from a variety of backgrounds to learn more about themselves and their communities. I think those are true of both the academy and of public sector work. That being said, there are conventions in both public sector work and the academy which are unique, and as Andy pointed out, and difficult to make a case for yourself unless you've had, as he said, some experience. Almost all state folklorists, and many of those who do consulting work as contractors, Lisa meant, need to be able to create budgets and be able to read a budget and be able to explain it in terms of writing. Your words in the public sector need to be accessible not only to the public but to your employers. I think Lisa talked about that. The over-reliance, and no offense, but on jargon and million-dollar words, which is sometimes valued in the academy. And I think it's gotten better. I just read a series of publications for a prize, and I was really delighted. There was one text that I had to look up a lot of words, but at the same time, it was accessible enough that it was recognized partly for the prize. So, but anyway, I could go off on that. But anyway, there are many acronyms in the public world which are just as opaque as some academic terms. And once you get into public sector work, if you don't learn those acronyms quickly, you will be at sea. You mentioned working in social services. I've gone in and out of working in public schools. You know, pretty quickly need to know what the acronyms mean, or you'll be talking to people and you have no idea what they're talking about. As someone who transitioned to the academy late in life, there is a whole body of work, some of which are sitting on my shelves, which I haven't read. And when I first began teaching at Goucher, I felt very inadequate because of this. I cried. A lot of my stories relate to crying. Because I felt really like a charlatan, you know, in a way. But I do have 35, 40 years of work in the field that my director keeps telling me is as valuable as some of the academic texts, so I try to believe her. I do want to say that not having a PhD is a disadvantage in the academic world, not only because of expectations, but because, as you probably have figured out, hearing us, it's difficult to find the time to read and digest texts once you're working in the public sector, unless you're working on an exhibit or a project that involves some research that isn't strictly field work. And even then, most people wear multiple hats, so the time to read and digest is difficult. Over the years, I've spoken with a number of folklore grad students, and I think this is improving at every institution. But I've heard this just this year from grad students who do not feel prepared to do public sector work. They may have had a survey course, but knowing how to find jobs, some of the things we've been talking about, how to make a claim for themselves in the public sector, and honestly being able to show they have the skill sets is a continuing issue. Likewise, for those of us with MA degrees, I think there's still a bias in the academy, including in our own professional society. If you look at the board membership of the American Folklore Society, I think almost everybody has a PhD. And when I ran the one time for the board, I was the only candidate without a PhD, and I lost, and I was also up against amazing people, so.
The pool.
The pool, again, it's the pool, as Andy said. Maybe if I'd managed to pick a year to run when not everybody was amazing, I might have gotten on the board. But it's an equity issue that I do think we need to think about, both for ourselves, for you as individuals, and as a field. So my best advice for moving between the sectors is to identify, and you heard this from Adrian, I think you heard it from Lisa, I think you've heard it from Andy. Find something you're passionate about, and then work to gain skills in both the expectations of the academy and the public sector to be able to find work you love. So start with the passion. Start with the stuff that you're really excited about, and when you explain it to other people, you light up, okay? And then figure out what are the skill sets that will help you get work in that. I have been very fortunate, but at the same time, as I said earlier at the beginning, I studied in multiple fields. I mean, I began as an English and it turned out British lit major, but I also got a certificate in education, which my parents, my mom went to a one-room school and my dad didn't learn English till he was 6, because he's a child of immigrants. My parents said, get a teaching degree, you'll always be able to find a job. Which was very ironic when I graduated with my teaching degree and could not find a job. But years later, I did consulting work for a high school, and they said, if you ever want to work for us, we'll hire you. And when one of my kids turned out to have a severe learning disability and couldn't read by the end of 2nd grade, and I needed to leave my full-time museum job, which was 80 hours a week, because I was doing multiple things, I got hired as a classroom teacher, and I was able to be on my kids' schedule. So I had been, and I was also a folklorist in that school. So again, what we've been saying about thinking creatively, not only was I a classroom teacher, but I ran a folk arts program in the school that I taught in. And again, that was having the experience of having done public programming. So I think we've heard us say that thinking about being able to work without the title folklorist is something that I think is increasingly, I think it's always been true, but I think it's really important in terms of being able to go between the fields. Most of the folklorists I know that are in the academy are not, well, I shouldn't say most, but many of the folklorists I know that work in the academy do not work in a department that says folklore.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions about anything?
So I'm in the process of transitioning from graduate student to professional, and the thing that I'm kind of not dreading, but I feel like I don't know how to do the most and I'm not prepared for it all, is how to have a work-life balance. Because as a student, it was zero. It was all work all the time, except for like when I was sleeping, and even then maybe not. And so now I feel like I'm totally unprepared to be a person and be a professional at the same time. And I was wondering if you had any advice on that.
Lisa, do you want to answer this one?
Well, I don't know how much I mean, you can decide, you need to decide for yourself how much you want to do, what you're willing to do, and that will change, that will come and go. When I started this job, I had a lot of freedom. I don't have children. We don't have children, I should say. We have a lot of children in our lives, but they go home. you know, we, we would sit, our kids, our friends' kids and whatever, and our parents weren't, needing, and grandparents weren't needing assistance at them, so a lot of training. I spent a lot of time, I made myself really available to our constituents. For me, the constituents I made myself available to were grantees, volunteer arts administrators who didn't have any kind of necessarily training for grant writing or museums or festivals or whatever, but they throw these things and they have a lot of more expertise at that than I did. But they work, they maybe have a regular job and then they do that work at night and the weekends. I made myself available via email primarily to them, and I was willing to do that. There are times when I will, you know, there's a project, if it's a festival, if it's an exhibit, if it's a grant that's due, whatever, that I know that I'm gonna work more than 50 hours a week, you know. I also try to make sure that I get some of that time back. When I worked at South Arts, the regional arts organization, we had to, kind of like attorneys a little bit, we had to code our time to projects. So for, you know, for the office, and then they would report that to the grant, you know, in grant reporting. So there were different codes for different projects, and I would break that out. And if you went over 40 hours a week, it was called donated time. And at that, truly, right, donated time. And so, and you know, periodically, I was working over 40 hours a week working above and beyond what I was scheduled, so donated time. And I mentioned that to my partner, you know, when it came up, and she said, that's not, she said, and my boss at that time was named Jeff Kesper. She says, that's not Jeff Kesper's time, that's my time. That's family time, that's our time. So it's really important to protect that, to figure out what it is that you need. I mean, at this point, I have a standing monthly appointment with a chiropractor. I have a standing monthly appointment with a massage therapist. I have, you know, I have created ways that if I have to pick up and run, you know, 300 miles away to be with my mother, that I can still get work done. I also have a really great bosses. And coworkers, okay? Can I just say that it's really important, we were talking about MAs and PhDs and that kind of thing. Don't privilege those people, privilege everyone. My mom was a secretary at the university. The secretary or administrative assistant, as we call them now, or the office manager, where those people run the joint, okay? And in any place, and we should, as folklorists, you know, again, with our training and our understanding and our sort of privileging all people, privileging the folk, and understanding that they have a great deal of knowledge that we don't have, that may not be academic knowledge or come from books. Work with them. I'm able to get away with some things and balance my life because our office manager makes sure that things get taken care of, for instance. Does that make sense? I'm not like spinning my wheels trying to fill out a travel voucher because she'll do it for me. But just, and then let me say, Lisa Ratchie, if you don't know her, she is the director of local learning, and she does, she used to do contract work. She did a contract for us, and she has a spreadsheet. It's kind of like what I was discussing.
It's actually, we're good friends, and
Yeah.
I've stolen it. It's actually called it's actually called a template for sanity.
Template for sanity.
And she, part of it is that, if I can jump in.
Yeah.
With, that she, her husband has a very full-time job. When she was doing contract work, she had a young child, and she was trying to figure out, she was committed to making sure that she was making enough money to pay for childcare, as well as being sane. And so because one of the hardest parts, I think, about work-life balance is because, you know, so I told you go follow your passion. So then the problem is you follow your passion, and your passion can eat up your life. Because, so just as an example, when I was at the Museum of Science and Industry, the reason I was working 8 hours a week when I left was that I was in charge of the artifact collection and the archives. Well, I hired an archivist, but we had a festival that was started in the 40s called Christmas Around the World, and it was being done very, very badly from a folklorist perspective. They were yelling at the folk, and they were it was awful. So I took it over. I did field work with all the community people, and then I ran Christmas around the world. That wasn't in my job description. So the last December I worked there, I worked every day but Christmas, which was nuts. I have 4 kids under the age of 10, and I was a single mother at that point. So it was crazy. So don't let yourself get sucked in through your passion to not, as Lisa said, carving out that time, making sure that you have that time. I'd say the other last thing I'll say, and I think this is getting better, and I did try this when I was working for the State Arts Council. At the time, they were very suspicious of this, but more and more I see people being able to work from home a certain day of the week, and I would think about that. You have to prove yourself first. They have to know as Andy has said, you have to know you're going to do the work. But yeah, I don't know where you're going to travel-wise, or whether that's a part of the equation is commuting. But that falls into time, right? I mean, if it takes you an hour to get to your job each way, those are 2 hours that you're losing to the rest of your work-life balance. So I'd also think about advocating for being able to work, as Lisa said, in different situations, and still do the things that you want and need to do for your personal life.
Yeah, may I just address it too, if that's okay? Yeah, so, and I'm going to invoke Lisa Rathje again, because I had a great conversation with her about that touched on this issue of work-life balance, and I'm going to reflect a bit off what Sue said in a second. And so the key thing, at the Vermont Folklife Center, we're very fortunate because even up to the executive level, we've kind of made some agreements in writing that you're not expected to work beyond the hours you're paid to work. And if you do, we can at least take some of that time as comp time. But and so I guess what I'll say is, like, there are things that one does to oneself, right? One takes on more than one can do. Then there are those things that you really can't necessarily control in the environment you're in, and it depends on what your boss is like, or what the board is like, and I've been very fortunate not to have to work in those environments where there's just an expectation that we'll throw whatever we can at people, and when they burn out, we'll find someone new, So that's some things you can control, and some you can't, I work from home 3 days a week. I work 30 hours a week by choice, and because we can afford it, because my wife earns a lot more than I do, and I'm sort of the primary after-school kid parent. That was a work-life balance choice, to say that we didn't want to have our kids in the after-school program every day until 5 or 6 o'clock. So I do that. They alternate days because of the balance. They do go some days. Thus far, it's worked for us financially and from a sanity perspective. So Lisa Rathje, as an example, is someone who works exclusively from home because she works for a nonprofit that lacks infrastructure. And she was explaining how, like, what her commute entails, which is cleaning the house, putting on the radio, playing a song, cleaning a room, going into her office, playing one more song, cleaning that room, and then when that song ends, that's work. And she's in there working for the duration, taking a break for lunch, I presume, and she works a solid block. My day's a lot more fluid, and that's good and bad, because I try to work a set number of hours a week. Sometimes I get all those hours in on a regular schedule daily. Other days I work a lot more and then less. But, my day is always punctuated, if not by appointments, I've got this other project and I got to work on it right now for a half hour, and then I'll get back to the other stuff, and then I'm still doing work into 7, 8 o'clock because of the way I've broken up my day. So that's another kind of work-life balance factor. It's like how you if you're working at home or working on a project as a consultant, let's say, or as a contractor, how you use that time. How do you say, okay, like for Lisa, this is work time. And there are times where I do that too, and there are times where I don't. So anyway, that's yeah.
I was also having a conversation with some colleagues earlier this week. We we took our own field trip on Wednesday, and I want to say one of the things that we really agreed upon was with this work-life balance, and it's probably, it may feel like it's too late, but it's in terms of incurring debt, and so I would say making your living smaller. You know, so we joke about you have a house like when we moved back to Columbia, we had a 2-bedroom, we lived in a duplex, okay, and just as an example, it was full of furniture, right, and then we moved down the street into a 4-bedroom, 2-bath house, right, because we kind of moved up, and we filled that up with furniture, you know, and then you know, like 10 years later, then you know, we kind of grew into, but. So we kind of live small, but there's always this thing, like as much money as you'll make, you'll spend. As big as your house is, you'll fill it up. But actually, if you can back off of that quite a bit, the stress of having to pay your bills and also, you know, pay for student loans, I know is incredible. And we've worked, not me, okay, I happen to be married to someone who's really smart about money and was taught to be smart about money. And so we haven't had the same kind of stresses. That frees us up a little bit right now in terms of thinking about not having to be stuck in, and not stuck, but be in jobs that are institutionalized, you know, that you do have infrastructure. You know, can we take the leap and not have insurance, right, provided, and pay, yeah, some things like this. So John Kay and I were the ones who were talking about money. You know, he and his wife, they live in a cabin, you know, but and to be able, John said, we're so freaked out. We know that it costs so much more now than it did when we were in school. But we also know that people have, some people that we know in our families have much better quality of life and lifestyles than we did when we were in graduate school and undergraduate. So you know, those Starbucks or whatever that thing is like can go toward the student loan and paying that down, you know what I mean? So you're not living with that like anchor, you know, that they really pull you down. And John said people are spending their retirement on student loans.
Scary.
So we've all been sort of working this certain cohort of friends to try to minimize our debt and save and do things smaller, so we do not feel quite so much like we are anchored in a negative way. You know, anchored with a boat is a positive way. Anchored without a boat and the anchor around your neck or your foot is not a positive thing. So if you can deal with that, if you can, it's not too late with student loans. Anything extra you can throw at that stuff, you know, for a little while is so cool and freeing, you know?
Two things I'll just say briefly. One, if you can, if you want to, find some kind of creative pursuit, whatever that means to you, you know? Maybe you're not necessarily going to become a master weaver. I mean, if you do, that's amazing. But give yourself the permission to try things, you know, creative practices, and it frees up a lot of your thinking and your sort of mental energy. Just narrowing in on a process and learning it is, I find, to be a very good way to kind of get myself out of a weird stress mode. Another thing too I'll mention is one thing I love about this field is it's full of interesting, articulate people, and we form, I think, good friendships rapidly. But after a certain point, it's nice to not ask about work, you know? So if you, especially with colleagues in this field, if you can find a way to, as your relationship grows, have, you know, talk about other aspects of your life, that's kind of fun too. So, and that again alleviates kind of this feeling like you're always working, right?
Yeah. Questions?
We were talking about like transitioning from the private sector to academic sector or maybe vice. So do you find that
So I was fortunate that,
You repeat the question.
oh, the question, so the question is
Generally speaking.
sorry, thank you. The question was, one of the requirements and expectations in the academic world is to have publications, and as we've already said, that's difficult to do reading and writing when you're in the public sector. So have I found, or any of us found, that being an issue in transitioning into the academy? So I have to be, first, full disclosure, that I lucked into my entree, actually both times that I've been an adjunct, was again through networking, through people that actually recruited me. So they already knew what I'd done, whether, you know, how much writing or not writing I'd done. But the best advice I can give you is to get a writing buddy. I've actually done the most writing in the last 4 years, and it's ironic because I'm fortunate that I'm at an academic situation where well, I'm also an adjunct, let me point that out. So I don't have tenure, I don't have a full-time position. That is one of the trends, again, in universities and colleges now, right, is to have mostly adjunct faculty. And I suppose you could say the good news is there isn't as much expectation as publication for adjuncts as there is for full-time. The bad news is you don't get benefits or tenure or, you know, the same kind. And, you know, there is a survey, by the way, I should mention, coming out on contingent work that the American Folklore Society is sending to all members, and we really, really ask you to fill that out, especially if you have been doing contingent work, because we're trying to lay out what the realities are for people that are in that situation of going back and forth and working on contract, whether it's in the academy or in public sector. But what's really helped me get a lot of writing done and actually publication is having a writing buddy. Because I love to write, but I also, because I teach writing, I also agonize about it. And so I have a 35-year-old project that I've been literally working on since my twins were born that I want to do a book on. I've even talked to a press. I have not done the book because I don't have a writing buddy, and I need to find a writing buddy. So if you're interested in material culture and dance costume, talk to me. But that's my best advice. And also think about the work that you've done in the public sector. So if you've done catalogs, write about that work. So write for a journal. So write about the exhibit development for you know, an association magazine. Start with something that's a kind of a natural leap, and then you could then think about the Journal of American Folklore or other journals, Western Folklore. Think about, because there's also a real interest in those journals in having work that's based in public work as well.
I'd say there's also the Journal of Folklore and Education. That's an online juried publication, and they are really accepting of a range of styles and lengths and content, but there's a theme every year. As I said, as a public sector folklore, I actually write all the time. I'm just not necessarily writing for publication. And I've had recent opportunities, especially for the Journal of Folklore and Education, to do a collaborative piece 2 years ago. There are several public statewide programs, public sector programs that are based not only at universities, but specifically based at university museums, about 5 of us or so. And 2 years ago, the special topic was museum studies. And I wrote to the editors and said, hey, is anybody actually writing about this for that issue? Because, you know, there's 5 of us who are doing these statewide programs that are based at, you know, university museums. What a cool idea. Yes, we absolutely, can you all do something? And then I wrote this summer, I actually collaborated with my sister-in-law who homeschooled my niece and nephew for a number of reasons. And so she's an educator, I'm an educator, but she's an educator, and we were able to write about science and place and foodways together and get a publication there. It's probably not an article that would end up in the Journal of American Folklore, but I absolutely love that we were able to do that work together. And I think there are more opportunities, even in JAF and some of those publications, to do more creative nonfiction. And so you think about that. And it's really, I think most recently that I felt that I found my voice for that kind of writing. And it's been a really cool thing, because I was, as a grad student and even an undergrad, was kind of intimidated often by what was expected of scholarly writing back in the day, to the extent that it took me 18 years to get my PhD, because I was ABD for 16 of those.
You beat me.
Oh, yeah. Well, I tried.
Jeepers, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we had another question.
Oh, yeah, I just had more of a kind of nuts and bolts question. From a hiring perspective, you mentioned the pool, and Adrian, you mentioned reading between the lines as an applicant. There's kind of this, I don't know if anyone else knows this or has heard this, but I've always been told there's kind of like a folklore around the application itself. The job will have like 10 requirements, but only the first 2 count. You don't need those. Like, if you meet all the other requirements, but you're only at number 7, don't bother. Is that true? Is that, I don't know. You tell me from a hiring perspective, how does that all work?
Not in my experience, it does. Yeah, I mean, when we put out a call, I'm trying to find a delicate way to say that we don't exactly know what we're doing, but we don't structure it that way, so that's never been an impact on how we've done hiring. Like, pretty much anything we list is kind of what we want, and then, which, if you look at some of the job calls, is like, who the hell is that person? So.
Yeah. I mean, there certainly is truth to the fact, I will say, in terms of this folklore or whatever around any job searches. There are often job descriptions that are written because they want to hire a specific person.
Yeah.
They have someone in mind.
Yeah.
And if you can find out if that's the case, then you can decide how much time you actually want to waste on that process. I will say that the job description when I applied 19 and a half years ago, I had deficits. I told you earlier I'm not a great field worker, and I didn't have a lot of experience at that. And I called up and picked up the phone, called Amy Skillman, who was a friend and a mentor of mine, and I said, what do you think I should do about this? She said, you may not go out into the field with cameras and recorders and do that kind of field survey, but you use your field working skills that you learned as a student, and in practice you use them every day. And it just boosted my confidence to think about. That's why I keep saying we're trained as folklorists. We know how to do these things. Apply those things. Think as a folklorist. Stop trying to think as somebody else. Like, we have these great skills that we can apply, and we should be applying to every aspect of our lives. But and so I was able to actually, and of course, since they were looking for a folk arts administrator, they were not quite so. They didn't really care if I had great field work skills or not. And the ultimate thing. And then when I did get hired, so that was the job description. I didn't do exactly what my predecessor did, because she had great strengths in other areas. And some of those things, I'm not going to do that. And then there's a second person in our office. The second person in our office had been there 10 years. And I'd been there 2, and she decided to quit. So we were in the process of deciding who does what, sort of, because they had divvied the work up in such a way based on strengths. So then I hired somebody in February of that, so I started in September, I hired somebody in February. She's still there. And what we did, there was a job description, and she had a lot of those qualities and everything, and I knew her work and her references were great. When she came in, we were able to balance the work in the office based on our our strengths and our challenges too. Right, so she's not trying to make me go out into the field and figure out, well, I don't know. I can't even talk with any if I have questions about cameras and recorders and stuff, I'll talk to Andy or Thomas or Debbie that I work with. But, so there's that kind of balance within the office too, Anyway, is that helpful?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
I would also venture to say that
Hi, I'm Terry. I would also venture to say that it might also depend on the kind of agency you're working for, because if you're working for a smaller independent place like the VFC, they can tailor that job description, whereas a state government agency or a university might have grades of jobs that they're required to list X, Y, and Z requirements, even though what the actual department is looking for might be a little more flexible. So keep that in mind when you're looking at the types of organizations you're applying for too, because in that case, for a government agency, they may be able to put more emphasis on one or two of the qualifications they list. It might be what they're actually looking for, but they're just required to list the rest of them. So keep that in mind as well.
To follow up on that point, I'm sure this is probably also the case with some university hiring systems, but definitely with a number of states, they have ranking systems, basically, where they'll ask you to kind of evaluate yourself, on a scale of 1 to 10. Make sure you're always choosing the 10, because they'll get this this pool, and the HR person will, or the system will basically kick out anything that's below a certain number. So that just, when you're, again, like these big sort of behemoths of institutions, they have these processes that are very troublesome. But I will say, familiarizing yourself with those processes, or just cultivating an awareness of some of those things, will empower you as a job seeker. So.
Yeah. One quick thing, and this is building off of the description of Lisa's experience, and it's sort of a cynical observation, but we've interviewed a bunch of people lately, and like in the context of an interview, this is another opportunity to use those skills you've developed to try to figure out what the culture of the environment is. Like in our case, if there's a deficit in someone's experience, and they've made it to the point of getting an interview, we're aware of that deficit, and the right thing to do in our case is to be upfront about it, in other places that actually might not be the case, but so I think it's important to get a sense of what the work culture is as best as you're able from the kind of exposure you've had, to figure out what the right approach is to manage things like that. I mean, and for us, it's always to be honest, because in most cases we know.
In professional development, whether it's formal or informal, is always an option. Just because you have a deficit in an area doesn't mean that it's not something that you can't either learn on the job or take some classes. Darcy Holgrave, that worked with us, has famously built some skills that she's applied in contract jobs just by using free online videos through some service that I forget what it's called. And she's become an incredible photographer and video editor. And that's certainly not something that she learned in my office, So that's the thing. I mean, we're constant learners, and we're not only. That's the other thing in terms of this, like relationships and mentorships. It's reciprocal. I learn at this point. I think I learn much more from my peers and the young professionals and new professionals that I work with. I learn much more from them than I do from my mentors. Okay. That doesn't mean my mentors are obsolete in my life or anything anymore at all. It's still an important relationship. But in terms of me learning and growing, I'm learning from my peers and from new professionals that I work with.
Thank you. And on that note, we're running out of time. So if you have any more questions for the panelists, please come up and talk to them. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.